Let's do our regular Queen's Park check-in, and to do that, we have two guests here in our studio. David Herle is a partner with the Gandalf Group. That's a communications consulting outfit here in Toronto, and you may also recognize him from his time as one of the insiders in Peter Mansbridge's studio. And John Mykytyshyn is on the other side of the table. He's with the Bradgate Research Group, and we welcome you guys here to TVO. Nice to see you both.
Great to be here.
Okay, let's do a check-in. Kathleen Wynne, she's been Premier for less than a month. How's she doing?
Well, I think you'd have to say she's doing pretty well. She's got the party back into contention in the polls. She's making headway on some of the public policy agenda items that she outlined, and she got some good job numbers today. And I think that relative to a month after leadership, she's in pretty good shape.
John?
I'd agree, and she's doing as well as you could expect, especially with such a bad hand being dealt her. But like most things in politics, none of it matters, and the time that'll matter is far in the distance.
What do you mean none of it matters?
None of it matters. It's like whatever the polling numbers are today. It doesn't matter what the numbers are today. It's not the horse race. It's what is going to be the deeper resonance, the real connection with people when they walk into the polls. When election day comes finally, and that's what everybody's waiting for, is it going to be an adjudication on Kathleen Wynne, or I still hate McGuinty?
Okay, but if new leaders tend to get a bump, David, right after they take over the leadership of a party, and if Kathleen Wynne had taken over and the Liberals had actually dropped 10 points in the poll, that would matter, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And the question is whether the bump is a sustainable one or whether it isn't sustainable. And that, John's absolutely right. That depends on what happens next and what happens going forward. They're obviously quite intent on distinguishing themselves from the past. They've even taken to calling themselves Ontario's new government, I think. And so, you know, it's a real challenge when you're taking over in these circumstances to thread that line between showing enough change. Inevitably, when you take over as Premier in a party, it's because the previous person left the job because they were in trouble and the public was unhappy. And so you have to demonstrate change from that. But on the other hand, you are carrying around the record of that government. To some extent, you have to defend and promote the record of that previous government, and you've got your party to worry about keeping it whole. So it's a real fine line to walk when you take over in midstream like this.
Let me give John just 3 examples here of how Kathleen Wynne has attempted to distance herself from her predecessor. She came in and she acknowledged, in fact, in that chair a couple of weeks ago, that the Mississauga gas plant was canceled for purely political reasons. She has acknowledged that she was not happy with the prorogation of the legislature that Dalton McGuinty did last October. And she also said that if she were in charge, the Bill 115 way of doing business probably wouldn't have been the way she would have been doing business. Would you advise her, I know you're a common sense revolutionary and you're used to advising conservatives, but if you were advising her, would you urge her to look for more things about which she could distance herself vis-a-vis McGuinty?
That's certainly one of the characteristics which would be good, but I think more important than that, and I think that's where politicians get into trouble, is when they're looking for the best photo op as opposed to the best policy. If she focuses on producing good government and doing the best job she can, then I believe that'll put her in a better position than going for the checklist of, see how different I am from Dalton. Like if that's the only game, then I think that's a mug's game, and that's not where a win for Wynne is.
David?
Well, I think that she's trying to do something that is an essential part of any effective communications campaign, which is stop denying what is obvious to everybody else.
Which is?
The power plants were canceled for political reasons. Stop denying that. Everybody believes that to be true. That is true. Say it. And then what you say after that has a chance of being taken credibly. If you deny the obvious, and it's the same thing with the prorogation, there's nobody in the province that thinks the prorogation was an appropriate thing to do. Why would she be the person that says, no, it was an appropriate thing to do? It wasn't her decision. She doesn't want to carry it around. And as long as she's defending those kinds of things, she has no chance to make her own mark.
So she hasn't defended them, and that's the right thing to do?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's unpack some of these issues. The teachers. The secondary school teachers have now said, I guess about a week or so ago, that they will provide extracurriculars unlike their elementary school counterparts. How big, in your view, a win for Wynne was that?
Very large. I think this is a big issue. I think this matters a lot. I think this issue matters a lot to the government. The government has staked a lot of its reputation on education and being an education government. She wants to, I think, continue to be seen that way. It's hard to have to be seen as an education government when you are at war with all the teachers in the province. So developing she said she wants to change the tone. This is an example that she has changed the tone of the discussion, and I think it has also had the effect of putting a lot of pressure on the elementary school teachers, who now look like they're being unreasonable.
John?
Well, to be fair, that's because they are being unreasonable. So I mean, she's doing the right things in that regard too, because why wouldn't she? Right? I mean, that's her natural inclination. It's not like she's doing something that goes against her grain. And she is right. I'm sure that there's more than one person around the cabinet table who would have done things differently. And now it's her shot. This is new leaders and new premiers are as much about substance as style, and that often gets lost in the daily reporting. So now, when it comes down to the next contract negotiation, that's where we'll really find out where she stands. And conveniently, there's nobody predicting that that contract negotiation will happen before the next election.
Well,
so the big Christmas gift that the last premier left her with a big bow on it was teachers off the table until after the next election, and then you can figure it out.
Although you never know. The contract expires August of 2014. There's no guarantee we're going to have an election before then. I mean, we probably will, right? But there's no guarantee. So we don't know. The elementary teachers are still not providing extracurriculars, though. Is that a kick in the teeth for Wynne?
I think it is, but it's not that she caused it, right? So where she gets a big plus and a check mark for resolving it at the secondary level, she may not have solved it at the elementary level, but she didn't cause it. So I think it's more neutral than a negative against her.
David, how about that?
I think that's right.
Okay. Let's talk. That's a nice short answer. I like nice short. Every now and then a nice short answer is okay. The Mississauga gas plant. I want to know, this of course was canceled by Dalton McGuinty in the dying days of the 2011 campaign in order to save seats in Mississauga and I guess maybe Etobicoke as well. And give me your sense, David first, about how much of an albatross this decision made by Dalton McGuinty is around Kathleen Wynne's neck.
Well, I think it's a big problem in the sense that it's such a huge distraction in Queen's Park. And it's really difficult for them to drive a news cycle around any other issue other than this one, as long as the opposition and the media are focused on conflict around that issue. So I think that she's trying to dissipate it through the release of more documents and for appearing to be as open as she possibly can about this. From my perspective, though, and I wonder if the ordinary citizen isn't like this, I'm getting a little confused about what the opposition actually wants out of this, because she has changed the government's posture on this matter. So we now have all three parties agreeing that the plant should never have been placed in Mississauga in the first place. We have all three parties agreeing that the plants should have been canceled. Even at the point that they were in the election campaign, or for the opposition parties, they would have canceled them even later had they
won government.
Had they won government. Mm-hmm. So there's literally no substantive dispute between any of the political parties about this.
Well, the dispute is what to do about it. The opposition wants a public inquiry, and the government doesn't.
But that's not a substantive dispute. That's now, we want to keep talking about this, and why do they want to keep talking about it? There's nothing to get to the bottom of anymore. It's been conceded that the decision was wrong. It's agreed that the plant should have been canceled, and we know how the decision was. We know that the Premier made the decision, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. Right? So, the Conservatives want a judicial inquiry, the NDP want a public inquiry. Both these parties just want to keep talking about this issue, and they're proposing different formulas that are really distinctions without a difference. But we don't need to learn anything more about how this went down. It was a mistake. It's going to cost the government. They have wasted money. There's no question. And that will be part of the ledger for them in the election campaign. That is a negative mark for them. But the real substantive issue that there is no agreement on, that if you were going to spend any time consulting with Ontarians about, which is how do we go forward and get energy in this province, right? That process doesn't work. How are we going to site electricity plants around the province? Which
is a different discussion, and frankly, no one's talking about that because they're, I guess, having the big conversation, which is the word of the week at Queen's Park now, conversation, over Mississauga. Okay, how much of that do you sign on to?
About 90% of it. And there's other issues, right? Like, where does it go from here? Is any political party leader suggesting that communities are going to have a referenda on future, sites?
No.
I don't see that happening, because the answer will be, then we're not going to have any future sites. No one ever wants anything like this in their backyard.
Right.
So, it's problematic. And it's hard, right? Because in terms of political parties, when you throw a big, juicy piece of meat on the table, they're going to go for it. And the government provided that in the way they handled this. So how do they not go after it? But and it's in the paper every day because there's nothing new to go after, right? I think there's far more substantive issues that they should be going back to, like Orange and things where there's actually criminal investigations for starters, right? Now, I get that the size of the money that they're talking about over the plants is phenomenal, and people can't comprehend how there's that much at stake. But it's, to me, the focus shouldn't be about canceling them. It should be about the incompetency in how they got there in the first place and how the government dealt with it and how they eventually canceled it. But at the end of the day, they listen to the voters, they listen to the other political parties. So if you did what the other parties wanted you to do, how do they ultimately hold you account?
Let me follow up with a story from Peterborough, Ontario, where we took this program a couple of weekends ago. And I was out to dinner, I guess, the night after we did our program, with a group of people from Peterborough who are all pretty plugged into Peterborough. Someone's involved, a couple of people in politics, some business, in the university field, in journalism. And I kept asking them, so the Mississauga gas plant story, how's that percolating out here? What are people saying about that out here? Crickets. It had not penetrated the consciousness of people in Peterborough at all. So is this a GTA story only, David?
I'm not even sure it's a GTA story. I mean, I think you asked John the question of whether the opposition was right to be focusing on it or not. And, I think to the extent that you're talking about the power regime in this province and you're not talking about the rates, you're missing the sweet spot politically of where things are at. I suspect that had you asked people in Peterborough about their electricity rates, you would have got quite a vigorous conversation going.
Right.
And the government commitment to continually raise them year after year, foreseeably.
So, I mean, that's what people are angry about in the power system. And, $200 and some million for a power plant is not as impactful a number to people as the amount that their bill that they have to pay on a monthly basis is going up.
Right.
And so I think that they're really sort of, they're probably off on something that feels a lot more important when you're in the legislature than it actually is. This doesn't have the feel to me of an issue that is going to defeat a government.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, and I think it's actually been an asset for the government in the seats where they were directly affected. People are clear about what they don't want in their backyard, and those government members can go into the next campaign. They may not be doing it today because they don't want to deal with the opposition benches, but I'm betting that there'll be a campaign pamphlet in each of those constituencies saying, I stopped the gas plant. That might be the only piece of literature they need to do, and and I'll continue to look after your interests. And isn't that what everybody wants? Somebody that when they go to Queen's Park and they deal with 107 people in the building, that they know their interests at the end of the day will be looked after, even if it's a terrible piece of legislation, or in this case, a terrible implementation of policy at the 11th hour, regardless of the cost, that the government, despite being in the middle of an election, and yes, they had political purposes, but is it really surprising that a party that's trying to hang on to power in the middle of a political campaign made a political decision? Are the other parties really saying that they would have never done anything like that if they were in the same situation?
Well, let me throw this on the table at the risk of being a constitutional nerd here. There is something called the Caretaker Convention, which is, it's not written in stone in law, but it is part of the tradition of our constitutional conventions that have come down from Mount Olympus since time immemorial, that in the middle of an election campaign, you don't make, if you're the premier, if you're the government, you don't make substantive political decisions because, in effect, it's not fair. You're the caretaker of the government of Ontario at that moment, but you really shouldn't be, for example, offering huge tax cuts that you hadn't talked about before, as David Peterson did in the 1990 election. So was this decision in the dying days of the campaign, David, I know you're not a constitutional scholar, but does it violate the spirit of you're not supposed to make these kinds of big multi-billion-dollar decisions kind of like by the seat of your pants?
You know, I think it's odd from that perspective. I do. And, you know, I think that's why you know that the decision was made by the Premier, because the bureaucracy would not have responded to anybody else doing that. And I think that puts a very sharp light on the political nature of the decision. But everybody's policy in this area is sharply political. So I don't know if there would be any cost for that. I mean, I don't think that people say, well, the Liberals canceled the Mississauga power plants politically, but the NDP would cancel it out of principle. I think that everybody says they're pandering, and they're all pandering. And so I don't know that there's a real winner in here. But I think that, to be honest, I would suggest that I think that you know, making a decision of that substance in an election campaign is a bit dodgy.
But having said that, the Finance Minister, Charles Sousa, will put on his campaign literature next time, I got this plant killed. Even though it cost $1 billion, I got it killed.
Sure.
And that works.
Delivering good policy to the local residents.
Okay. Let's do a little virage here and talk about Tim Hudak. Leader of the Conservative Party has, I guess over the last several months, unveiled, he might be up to a dozen now, I'm not sure, position papers on a wide range of issues that have very clearly planted his flag and his party's flag in the small c Conservative column. And I just want to know what we think about the advisability of doing that. John?
I think it's been great. I think it's kept him current. There was a great opportunity for him to sit back and be silent during the Liberal leadership. And rather than letting the Liberals take all the media, he did what he should be doing from his perspective while the Liberals were figuring out who next. And that was to say, what about me? And to make himself relevant. And at the end of the day, why Tim Hudak and why the Progressive Conservative Party? And he started that conversation. And to be fair, he started it before, but you're right that he ramped up speed on that. I saw him at Christmas time, and I frankly congratulated him on being relevant and out there, and for also having substantive policy conversations. Now, it could be clear that they put out policy papers, right? So it's not the party platform yet, which means if he put one out there that really stunk up the room, I think you wouldn't see it in a campaign platform. But what he's been doing has been very planned, very, you know, and it's, you know, shades of a formula I saw once before done well.
Would that be the common sense revolution?
Well, the precursor, which was the New Directions, and you know, a series of policy papers to engage people in a conversation on an issue-by-issue basis to say, why me? What would be the difference if my party and I were there instead of the current people? And he started that conversation, and like I say, through the entire Liberal leadership process, he was in the papers on a regular basis, as opposed to being silent like they were last year during the non-the-budget debate, if you might.
Yes, I remember it well. As a Liberal, what do you think of his doing that?
Well, I can certainly see the positive rationale for it. I think that one of the problems that the Conservative campaign had in the last election is that it looked like they'd put together a grab bag of populist ideas that were designed quite specifically to try to win an election, but not really much of a governing plan. And when people thought things were getting serious about the economy and worried again about where things were going, that didn't really look like a government in waiting to them. There wasn't enough heft or substance behind what they were saying. And I think that this goes a long way to fill those gaps in and to eliminate that criticism. I don't think you'll hear from people that Hudak doesn't have a coherent, thought-through plan. Whether it works or not, I think is going to be interesting to see in the long term, because I think they're actually taking a page out of the Ottawa Conservatives' book in this regard, in that the positions that they're taking are not designed to get them, I don't think, 45% of the vote from the electorate. Their position is designed to firm up probably about 1/3 of the electorate that is quite conservative and motivate those people to come out. So you firm up, establish a base, firm it up, motivate those people to come out, and count on a resurgent NDP splitting enough of the Liberal vote to make your 35 to 38% get you across the finish line. And so they are heavily reliant upon that split vote between the Liberals and the NDP. And if Kathleen Wynne, on the other hand, is successful at persuading a lot of sort of swing Liberal NDP voters that she's good enough, and the Hudak Conservatives have presented a bit of a conservative bogeyman to the progressive majority of Ontario, then it may not be enough to get them over the top. But they have a substantive policy, but it's quite strategically placed to position them in a narrow but motivated corner of the electorate.
In which case, does this so focus on the Conservative base that it prevents them, when the next election comes, from making that tent a little bit bigger and picking up the next 5 or 6% you need to form government?
Well, I think that depends on how you define the base. So I know you and probably every other media personality in the country likes to talk about how increasingly we have less and less people participating, which actually isn't accurate.
I would say fewer and fewer, but go ahead.
It's a lower percentage. There's actually more and more people voting in every election. It's just the percentages out of whack because of our growing population. But if you look at results, what I know to be true is that in a world of who do you go after? Is it these gushy people that swing back and forth between the parties? I think there's a deeper breadth, which I wouldn't call it the core, but I'd say small c conservative-minded people. I would say that there were more people who voted for Ernie Eves than Tim Hudak in the last election. There were almost 500,000 more people who voted for Mike Harris in '99 than voted for Tim Hudak in the last election. And in the same election year, in 2011, we had a federal election in Ontario, and that's very rare, so it gives you some interesting comparison points. And a guy who's never been called warm and friendly or fuzzy, even though he's worn a great-looking sweater, Stephen Harper got just shy of 1 million more votes for the Conservative Party, which one would almost, I'm sure you'd argue that the federal Conservative Party is way more scarier than the provincial party, got almost 1 million votes more than Tim Hudak did. So in a world of, if you're looking, and Tim...
You mean just in Ontario?
In Ontario. So, and on a base of 1.5 million. So if you got 1.5 million, and you're only 100,000 or so votes behind the Liberals in the last election, and you go, do we try to find the people on that 100,000 that we could swing over? Or what about this pool of almost 1 million people that are out there that went to a polling station, cast a ballot.
For a conservative.
For a conservative. Maybe we should be talking to those people and in the sense of speaking to them to the things they believe in.
I think it's a mistake to look for parallels where they aren't perfect, though. I mean, Stephen Harper's run in 4 elections in Canada, and he has never run on a platform as conservative as the one that Tim Hudak is starting to outline to Ontarians. Harper shades his conservatism in election campaigns and tries to look like he's mainstream. Put on the sweater, and don't worry, everything will be fine. Mike Harris ran on a quite conservative platform, obviously, in 1995. 2 differences there, and I'm interested to hear your perspective on this. One of which is, I don't think there was much doubt that in Ontario in 1995, people thought that high deficits and high taxes were among the biggest problems facing the province.
For sure.
And I don't think that most people in Ontario think that right now. They're more concerned about their own balance sheet than they are about the government's balance sheet at the current time. The second difference is that Mike Harris is an extremely avuncular guy. And in the tradition of Ronald Reagan, avuncular conservatives have a much easier time getting people comfortable with conservative ideas than kind of stiff people do.
You're saying Hudak is stiff?
Hudak is very stiff compared to Mike Harris, I would suggest. And I think that he's going to look harsher and harder when selling those ideas than Mike Harris did.
Can I put some numbers on this, John, and then have you respond to that? Forum did a poll the other day, and I think published what most people who follow this stuff already knew. Andrea Horwath is running plus 26 in terms of popular versus negative. Kathleen Wynne was plus 2. Tim Hudak is minus 20. 20% more people think he's doing a bad job than think he's doing a good job. How locked in do you think those numbers are?
Again, I don't think they're locked in. It depends. Locked in, again, is relative to how close the election is, right? If we're talking a spring election, it's much more locked in than if it's a fall election. It's a lot less locked in if it's a spring 2014 election. And it really comes down to how do people come to that conclusion, right? So I think that even among the conservative base, there's still a lot of people who aren't happy that Tim didn't win the last election. Certainly that was the expectation. Certainly the party, overwhelmingly, just shy of 80%, gave him a pat on the back and said, we get the mea culpa, we take you at your word, you've learned from your mistakes, and we're behind you. But the party, I think, is substantially, based on those numbers, ahead of the voters, and there's still work to be done.
Okay. Let's finish up on...
I'm just going to say, the other thing there is, I was surprised in listening to the media coverage that people were asking Tim about the numbers and what he thought, given where he was. And I thought he was nice in downplaying them, but he had an easier line of, he could have said, well, if I remember 2 months prior to the last election, I was 12 points up, and it didn't turn out that well, so I'd rather run behind this time. Thank you very much.
Fair enough. Let's finish up on this. I know neither of you are New Democrats, but the fact of the matter is that the Liberal government's survival now depends on the NDP. And I'm wondering if you can just help us with a bit of the calculation of what they're going through right now. They're supporting the throne speech, but it's up to the budget. Are there any circumstances under which you think it's a good idea for the NDP to defeat this government on the upcoming budget, just in terms of timing and all of that kind of thing?
Not likely, because I don't think it fits their strategic purposes. I think the NDP has gone through such a fundamental culture shift in this country over the last 10 years or so, and they very deliberately moved from being a party that saw itself as the conscience of Canadian politics and as people that were there to promote a set of ideas, and very much now an electoral machine, the same way that the other parties are, whose primary purpose is to gain power. And they've inculcated at all levels of the NDP that the impediment to them achieving power is not the Conservative Party, but the Liberal Party. And so, in my view...
just because you're both fishing for center-left votes, is that why?
That's right. That as long as the Liberal Party... They have chafed for years that the Liberal Party steals their votes at election time and then governs in a center-right fashion, campaign from the center-left, govern from the center-right, and they're left holding the bag. So they are... I don't think that their mission... People talk about Stephen Harper being determined to destroy the Liberal Party, and I think he is, but I think the NDP are no less determined to destroy the Liberal Party and get them out of the way. And so I think that you would look for the provincial NDP to force an election, not necessarily when it's most propitious for them to win, but when it is most propitious for them to drive the Liberals into third place.
And do you see those circumstances in position in terms of a spring budget vote?
I do not.
You don't? Okay. John?
We started the conversation today talking about Wynne and her ability to distance herself from the past. And with the greatest respect, I think Andrea, of all the leaders, has had the biggest challenge, which is getting people to forget the name Bob Rae. And I think she's accomplished that. And I think it's not just been time and a leader in between, but I think she's done that based on her and her personality and the way she's been governing her party and the way she shows up in the legislature.
Well, and the fact that Bob Rae's a Liberal now probably helped too.
Well, it doesn't hurt. You can always argue he always was a Liberal, but that goes to character.
That's what New Democrats say.
But I think that not enough people have given her credit for the work that she's done, and there's the two parts of that. One is Bob Rae, radioactive, will never vote for that party ever again, and that party didn't change its name. They changed leaders a couple times, but so a new leader who's done the job of helping people not forget the past, but let it go. That the party today, the NDP today, is not Bob Rae's NDP. And that she's presenting herself as someone who, if the circumstances were to arise and the scariest of all things happened in Ontario and she became premier, I don't think anybody's using the word scary to describe that. They're describing it as a potential outcome, but not scary, not demonic, not catastrophic. So that's having moved an awfully far away. And interestingly enough, what is the goal for each of the parties in the next election? The Liberals, clear, they want to maintain the government. But what if they fall short? Who would prop them up? Well, the NDP apparently. And Tim Hudak, well, his goal is to become the next premier. But what if he was one seat short like McGuinty of a majority? Does anybody think that the Liberals and the NDP wouldn't get together to prevent that the way the Conservatives were prevented from having the government in '85?
So the point is, for Tim Hudak to become premier, they've got to win a majority.
He needs to get a majority. And in the scenario, if Andrea's goal is to knock, and around election timing, to have it go or be at a time where the Liberals fall to third place, she's in a much better position to work out a deal for the next government than if she's in third place.
If you were advising, would you tell her to pull the plug on the budget?
Absolutely not. There's no reason. There's nothing. Ontarians, voters in general, don't like elections. They like democracy when it's forced upon them, but they don't want them for the sake of it, and they get annoyed by the cost of it. So whoever forces an unnecessary election, that's the key word, necessary or unnecessary, is going to pay a price. And I don't think anybody's saying there's a compelling reason to have one now.
Gotcha. That's John Mykytyshyn from the Bradgate Research Group, along with David Herle from the Gandalf Group, and one of Peter Mansbridge's insiders. What do we call you here? You're not an insider here, but you're a...
Guru.
Washed up might work.
No, we like it too much. Anyway, guys, thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.